Appreciate that beautiful music that we heard in the background. It sounded vaguely familiar, didn't you think? Well, I'd like to conclude the Nehemiah study today. We've had several, I don't want to call them interruptions in our series. We've had happy interventions, whatever you want to call them, but I'd like to conclude the study today on the book of Nehemiah. If you want to be turning there, it's found in Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. So far in the series, we've talked about vision, discouragement, and prayer. And there's a phrase from the June 11th sermon that I'd like to look at today. It says, they were living in ruins, they accepted it. They were living in ruins, and they accepted it. I'd like to talk about refusing to accept the unacceptable. Refusing to accept the unacceptable. And our text is Nehemiah 1, 1 through 4. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. So Hanani had returned from the homeland in Judah and the city of Jerusalem, and Nehemiah was quizzing him as to the situation back in the homeland. They said to me, those who survived the exile, those who had stayed behind and survived, those who were not taken away into captivity, are back in the province and in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Its gates have been burned with fire. Nehemiah said, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. Some days I mourned, fasted, prayed for the God of heaven. So you have a fellow Nehemiah who was in a foreign country, who was basically captive, but he had worked himself to a fairly prominent position. You might say he had it made. And why would he care about the situation back in his land? Why was he even concerned? Why was he concerned enough to mourn and weep and fast over the condition of his homeland? That tells us a little bit about his character, I think, right there. The news that he received was not good. In his homeland, in the city of Jerusalem, the walls of the city were broken down. They were in ruins. They were in shambles. And they had not been rebuilt. Now, that might not seem like a big thing to us, but it was a big thing to them in that culture. The walls were their first line of defense against marauders and pillagers and plunderers and invading enemies. If you didn't have walls, those enemies could come and go as they please. Plus, it was a sign of disgrace. Think that you were defenseless and that you didn't have the resources to be able to rebuild a city. And so it was humiliating to the people of Judah. So as Nehemiah listened to this report, he could barely stand it. God's people, his people, were in ruin and disgrace. He was broken over the situation. He was broken over the apparent complacency of the people of Jerusalem. How is this okay with them? How have they learned to live with this unacceptable situation? How had they learned just to ignore the rubble and step around it and go about their daily lives? It was puzzling. He was far, far away, I think 800 miles away, but it troubled him. And seemingly, the people of Judah had learned to accept it. I wonder, are there situations that break your heart? Do you look around and you see ruins and shambles and situations that to you are unacceptable? Maybe in your family, maybe in your community, maybe in your own life. You know it's unacceptable. You know it shouldn't be. It needs to be addressed, but so far it hasn't. How could the people of Jerusalem be okay with this situation? Nehemiah had never even been to Jerusalem, and yet he was concerned, and evidently they were not. At least not enough to do anything about it. He lived in comfort in the palace, yet he wept, mourned, and fasted and prayed over the condition of Jerusalem. And we need more people like that. We need people who are willing to intercede on behalf of others, who seemingly don't know how to intercede or are not concerned or burdened. We need people to stand in the gap and pray for those who cannot or will not pray for themselves. May his number increase. Remember the story of the fellows that brought their friend to Jesus? He was unable to himself, but they brought him. We need people to intercede on behalf of others like Nehemiah did. People of Judah were living right in the middle of the rubble and evidently had found some way to accept it because it had been that way for over 90 years. They'd gotten used to it. It was their new. They were willing to walk around the devastation and instead of being concerned enough to do something about it. They were living in ruins and they accepted. First of all, when we are confronted with an unacceptable situation, we must respond in some way. Now, there are a lot of different ways that we could respond. We must do something about it, or we must learn to tolerate it, one of the two. If we choose to tolerate it, we must somehow desensitize ourselves to it. Ignore it. Justify it. Rationalize it. Minimize it. Try to tell ourselves, oh, it's not all that bad. It could be a lot worse. Other people have a lot worse situations than this, and to do that, we could procrastinate. We could tell ourselves, one of these days I'm going to deal with that situation. One of these days I'm going to offer that apology. One of these days I'm going to pay that debt. One of these days I'm going to try to build that bridge. One of these days I'm going to try to tear down that wall and that relationship. One of these days. We could numb ourselves by becoming apathetic or indifferent. Apathy and procrastination, coping mechanism. A lot of people use to avoid ability. We could do those things. How were the Jews able to come to terms with a seemingly intolerable situation? How did that come about? Well, I think I have a kind of an idea how it could come about. If you'll allow me to use a rather crude illustration. I know Charlene's cringing in her seat over there. When I was a teenager, I worked my way through high school and college, out chicken houses with a shovel and a wheelbarrow. That was one of the many despicable jobs I had, catching chickens, and whatever I could find to do. And people would say, how do you stand that smell? And to tell you the truth, I would drive by a field and I'd ask myself, how do I stand? But there's something that God has built into the human body that as stimulus it's unpleasant over time, we somehow develop the ability to shut it off. I could honestly be right in the middle of that stench and not even smell. I think maybe that's how it happens. Because Roman numeral 2, God has given us an amazing ability to adapt. We have an ability to tune out things that we don't want to experience. When I was growing up at home, we had this really, really loud ticking clock set on a shelf on the wall, and I didn't even notice it until we got our first little cassette player, Panasonic, about like that. Started recording things. I play that tape back, and I'm thinking, what is that ticking sound? And I looked, sure enough, it was the clock. It had been going on all the time, but somehow my brain had been able to tune out that ticking because of this amazing ability that God has given us to adapt to our situation. People tell me that they live by a railroad track. And a train going by in the middle of the night doesn't even. Now, like I said, this can be a good thing. It can be a bad thing. The problem comes when we adapt to things we shouldn't adapt to. We tolerate things we shouldn't tolerate, and we get used to things that we shouldn't get used to. That's when the problem comes. Now, you've all heard the story of the frog in the boiling water. I have no idea if that's true. I've never tried it. Never put a frog in a pan of water and turned the heat on to see if it'd stay in there. But it makes a good illustration. They tell me that since the frog is cold-blooded, that you can temperature gradually enough that the frog won't even realize it and will stay in that pan and boil to death. I have no idea if that's true, but I do know that if things happen gradually enough, we can adapt to almost anything. People used to ask me if things had changed a lot in my 37 and a half years. And I said, well, you know, it happened so gradually, I'm not really sure. I never even noticed. I see purple hair walking down the hall. If things happen gradually enough, you remember the 60s? Some of you do. When they took prayer out of school, prayer and Bible reading, trying to take Ten Commandments out of public life. If things happen gradually enough, we sit by and we tolerate things that we tolerate. I've heard people say, oh, I'm used to profanity. I hear it all the time. Should you really get used to someone using God's name in vain? Should there ever become a time in your life when that just doesn't kind of just fall over you? There's some things you just should not get used to. If you repeatedly expose yourself to impurity, if you repeatedly expose yourself to sexually explicit music videos, movies, etc., you'll desensitize your own morality. You'll skew your judgment and your perception. Everything that enters the mind through the senses will affect you. Everything. Faulty input leads to faulty perception, which leads to faulty judgment, which leads to faulty choices, which leads to faulty living. Some things we just should not get used to. You think it's an accident the entertainment industry is constantly stretching the limits of what Americans would consider acceptable? I think that's an accident. I think so. Just to check it out, I was sitting at my desk yesterday and there was a rubber band in the beside me. I took that rubber band and I very precisely measured that rubber band against. Got too much time on their hands. I stretched that rubber band and then I measured it again. Guess what? It didn't go back to its original dimension. And when people push the envelope and when they push we don't ever go back the way things. Think of the TV shows years ago. My age and older, remember Ozzie and Harriet? Leave It to Beaver. How about this one? Father Knows Best. There's a novel thought. If we were writing that show today, we'd say Father knows nothing, kids know best. See, that's how far we've come in my lifetime. Contrast those shows to some of the shows on television today. Sometimes we get used to things we should never get used to. An old commercial that says, you way baby. I know what product that was. Virginia Slim cigarette geared toward women. And it was an expression of, yes, right, we have come a long way. Much of it is in the wrong direction. Accepting the unacceptable. Tolerating the intolerable. Are there areas in your personal life that should be unacceptable, but learn to live with them? How about your relationship with God? How about your quiet time, your prayer time, your Bible time? How about your relationship with your spouse or your family? How about your habits, your priorities? Have you learned to tolerate situations that really stink, that you hardly even notice the smell anymore? Have they become your new normal? How about your church, your community, your nation? Although there are still many things that are great about our nation, there are many areas where we might qualify as the frog boiling water. Learn to be complacent. Learn to accept unacceptable situations. What does the Bible say about people who are complacent? Found in Amos chapter 6, verse. Woe to you who are complacent. Woe to you who are complacent. The King James says, at ease. Woe means grief, sorrow, affliction, a miserable, sorrowful state. Woe to you who are complacent. Those words sound strange and contrary to the way the world thinks. You know, the world would think that someone who's complacent, at ease, who's having a good time and don't care too much about the rest of the world, we would think that would be a great thing. I mean, after all, you only live once. Might as well just reach for the gusto, right? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die. Complacency. Whatever. Who cares? Somebody's got to. Someone has to refuse to accept the unacceptable. Someone has to dig in their heels and say, that's far enough. That's as far as I go. That's as far as we. I can't tolerate the intolerable. Ephesians 5:14-16 says, wake up, O sleeper. Rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. It's time to wake up. My alarm clock went off this morning. I knew it was time to wake up. We have alarm clocks going off all around us. Does the Holy Spirit ever sensitize you to a particular situation? You walk by and you see that situation and you think to yourself, somebody ought to do something. Somebody ought to do something. Well, the fact that he sensitized you to that situation is a good indicator that somebody might just be you. That might just be your project. Nehemiah asked a question. Do you ever suppose that I wish I had never asked that one. If I'd never asked how things were back in Jerusalem, then I wouldn't have ever been called to do something about it. I could have just relaxed here in my ease and complacency in the palace where I've got it made in the shade, no problems. But I had to ask. I had to open my big mouth. Sometimes when God sensitizes us to a situation, a relationship, does God ever bring people to your mind and you say, we've kind of drifted apart. I really ought to write a letter or a text. I ought to try to establish that person. You ever get those feelings? Listen to those. Because chances are it's the Holy Spirit awakening you. Situation needs to be addressed. It's time to wake up. As with Nehemiah and the walls, no significant improvement will occur until we care enough to weep over the ruins. Let that sink in. You'll never build any walls until you weep. You'll never make any significant progress until you get so sick of the way things are that you have to do something about it. And I didn't say worry about it. I didn't say gripe and complain about it. I didn't say blame somebody else for it. I didn't say shift responsibility. I said weep. No significant change will happen until we are concerned enough to do something. How many have ever watched Hoarders? The Hoarders show? I'm wondering, how do you ever get okay with it? How do you ever get okay with trash stacked to your ceiling? Little tiny paths around through your living room. I saw one show where there was about that much breathing room top next to the ceiling, and that's where they had to crawl around. How do you get okay with that? I'll tell you how. One little piece of trash at a time. That's how it happens. Broken relationship here and then another. Misplaced priority here and there. A destructive habit and then another. And before you know it, your life is out of control. You're not even close to where you thought you'd never be in this place, but suddenly you are. It's like the little sheep that he never really intended to get lost from the flock. It was just one nibble at a time. And before long, he didn't even know where the flock was. He was all by himself. Time to wake up. Time to let God do some rearranging, building, and concern is the first step. Nehemiah got it right. You ever watch any of those fixer-upper programs? They're kind of hard for me to watch sometimes. They take a sledgehammer to a perfectly good cabinet. I'm kind of cringing, That was a good cabinet. What are you doing? What are you thinking? And it's kind of hard to watch sometimes. But it's sometimes in our own lives, there are things that we've learned to accept, that we've learned to tolerate, that we kind of learn to live with, and we just need to hand God the sledgehammer and say, God, here I am. Search me. See if there be any wicked, if there's anything in me, Lord, that's contrary to your will, if there's anything that's displeasing to you, if there's anything that's hindering my witness or my effectiveness for the kingdom, Lord, just have at it. Roman numeral 5, true concern will compel you to do something. Actions speak louder than you can say all day long that you care. You can say you're concerned, but what you do tells what's really true. Nehemiah's concern caused him to do something. Verse 4 said, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Commentators estimate that it was probably about 4 months. This time of mourning and fasting and praying was about 4 months. That's a great first step. And by the end of that prayer time, that fasting time, he knew exactly what he had to do. When God's people pray, difficult decisions fall into proper perspective and appropriate actions follow. It all of a sudden becomes crystal clear what I have to do. Now, the church in America has been referred to as a sleeping giant. How much of a threat is a giant that's sleeping? How much of a threat is a giant that all of a sudden wakes up? I think it's time we woke up. And I think it's time it starts right here. Judgment begins in the house of God. Proverbs 6:9 asks the question, how long will you lie there, you sluggard? I don't think that's complimentary. Something about sluggard, it just sounds kind of derogatory to me. I don't know. How long will you lie there, you sluggard? When will you get up from your sleep? I think the time's now. I think it's time we stop walking around the rubble. I think it's time we stop tolerating the intolerable and accepting the unacceptable. I think it's time we drew a line and said no more. That's it. That's as far as I go. Now, I don't know what broken down walls, that's a metaphor, I suspect that probably your walls are not broken down. I don't know. The roof's still up and all of that. Walls are probably not broken down. This is a metaphor. broken down walls, a metaphor for some unacceptable situation in your life that needs attention. What did the Holy Spirit bring to mind as you sat there? Because I would just guarantee thought of something that needed. Don't forget it. Jot it down. Do whatever you need to do. But get out of your comfort zone. Do something about the unacceptable situations in your life. 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people, that's us, who are called by my name, that's us, Christians, will humble themselves, my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, and then will I hear from heaven. Forgive their sin. That's the problem today. Too many people who are called by his name don't care enough to humble themselves and pray and seek his face. You might think, well, I don't have any wicked ways. I'm a Christian. I quit that wickedness. I got saved. Well, you know there are sins of omission too. There are things that we should be doing, and James says, we say we care, but often our actions say something else. Sometimes it seems like it's more about us than it is about him. So, let's take a lesson from Nehemiah. Let's care enough to ask the hard question. Let's ask them of ourselves. Let's ask them of one another. Ask the hard questions. Be concerned enough to humble yourself and pray and seek his face. Turn from our wicked ways, and then, like Nehemiah, let's be obedient to the Lord's leading. Let's let God use us to reclaim, renew, and rebuild the broken down walls of our lives and those around us. Would you stand with me, please?